Good evening. My name is Jason Harris. I'm here with Charles Bracelen Flood, author of Grant's Last Victory, Ulysses Grant's Heroic Last Battle. And the date is October 15th, 2011. And we're here to talk about the book. So thank you for spending time with us this evening.
Delighted to do it.
So what was the inspiration for this book?
Well, if I may back up a little bit, Jay, I never originally liked the Civil War very much, but I started a long time ago changing my mind about Robert E. Lee. And I was a Northerner who had a great-grandfather in a Confederate prison. I seemed an unlikely guy to be a candidate to write a warm, sympathetic study of Lee, but I started reading up on Lee and thought, well, this man is just as good as the South always thought he was. So I wrote a book called Lee's Last Years, which is about the 5 years of Robert E. Lee. Well, at the end of that, of course, you come to, or rather the beginning of that, you come to Appomattox, and that's where I first sort of met Grant. And years passed, and I never could get Grant out of my mind. And so I was looking for Grant, but Grant what? Grant who? Grant in what connection? And the idea came to me of Grant and Sherman. And interestingly enough, nobody had ever done that book, which when it appeared, written by me, was Grant and Sherman, the friendship that won the Civil War. And it was not a gimmick, it was really true. That was the friendship and military partnership that won the Civil War. So that, of course, near the end of that, we come to Lincoln shortly before his assassination. And then there was Lincoln, and I thought, that's like Mount Everest. I can't just, try to climb Mount Everest, but sometimes there's a trail somewhere up Mount Everest. And I came up with the idea of 1864, Lincoln at the Gates of History, which was valid. And again, it wasn't a gimmick. It was the idea that that was the year that the Union still could have lost the war. Lincoln had to win the war in that year and get reelected. So that made a pretty juicy but not Mount Everest-sized topic. And so that then led me to think, well, Grant. And there's a scholar who died an untimely death a few years ago named John Y. Simon. And he had written this, or edited this tremendous feat of American scholarship called The Papers of Ulysses S. Grant. And near the end, I had a chance to talk to him. He's already very near the end of it. And I said, well, what hasn't been written about Grant? He said, well, it's very thin near the end of his life. And then he died, and the job was taken over by a very able man named John Marszalek, who's finishing the job in a way that I think John Simon would have approved of. So there I was with the last 14 months exactly, of Grant's life. And again, almost nothing had been done on it. So, each time you go into one of these things, you think, well, has it been done, or has it been done too often, or done in a superb way that there's no room to do more? But I felt that there was room to do this, and I think there was.
Well, speaking of Sherman, he's a major character in this book. He stayed with Grant basically until the end.
They'd had their fallings out after the Civil War about who should do what as Secretary of War and this and that. But near the end, when he saw that Grant was dying of cancer of the throat, he came up to New York and could hardly believe it, because all through the war it had almost been like he saw Grant, who was actually younger than he was, as a kind of a father figure, but he just couldn't believe and didn't want to believe that Grant was really terminally ill. And he became convinced of that, and then he wrote one of his daughters from New York. He said, Grant says my visits have done him more good than the visits of all the doctors combined, which probably was true, because they were great friends. And so he did, and he was indeed there at the end. And then when Grant was buried in the cliffs above the Hudson River in Manhattan, Sherman was the man standing in dress uniform at salute as the taps were played at the end. And he was at salute and standing up, but he was just convulsively sobbing. So he was with Grant right to the end.
Another interesting character from the book is Mark Twain.
No.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain to our audience their relationship.
With pleasure. They had known each other before, but what happened was when Grant, after his time in the White House, he and his wife Julia went on a 2-year trip around the world. And then they floated into the world of New York, where a lot of millionaires, including J.P. Morgan, got up some money because they really saw in Grant, in a different field, the same kind of vision, the same kind of energy, the same kind of imagination that they had made great successes in their own fields. So he ended up with a house in Manhattan, and he was thought he was a millionaire at the time. He turned all of his money over to a man called the young Napoleon of Wall Street named Ferdinand Ward. Well, it turned out that Ward was running a Ponzi scheme, and that Grant, who thought, and I quote in Grant's inimitable language, he thought he was, quote, nigh onto a millionaire at a time when a household servant would get $5 a week. He suddenly lost all his money because Ward was really running a Ponzi scheme, and so he had no money. That's when, that's when Mark Twain, who he already knew, appeared and said, I can get you out of this. I'm going to get you to write your memoirs. And Grant said, I can't write, I just write orders and after action reports. But Twain said, those action reports and everything are the most clear English language that's ever been written. And so Grant said, okay, I'll try. And then Twain was just amazed. He thought it was going to be profitable and get Grant out of trouble and make him, Twain, some money. But what he read, he said it was equal to Julius Caesar's commentaries, and it did turn out to be a tremendous 2-volume piece of work. Now, what happened on the way to this was that as Grant was starting in on this, he was diagnosed as having cancer of the throat and the tongue because of these literally thousands of cigars he'd smoked in his life. So now, 20 years after Appomattox, the American public, North and South, sort of were pulling for him. It was the Native American instinct to pull for the underdog, and a lot of the wartime stress had been somewhat forgotten, and so they all just had great sympathy and the sense of, can he finish this book before he dies? And nobody knew whether he had 3 months, 6 months, and as it turned out, he finished the book on July 20th, 1885, and died 3 days later with his wife Julia holding his hand. And then came one of the great episodes of that whole era, which was that in Manhattan, the figures ran, but the estimates ran between 500,000 and 1,500,000 people. Largest crowd ever on the North American continent turned out to watch his funeral parade go up to what now is the area of Grant's tomb. At the time it was a much simpler brick sort of structure. And they saw in this parade, they saw past presidents in carriages, they saw the justices of the Supreme Court, every governor of the state going past in carriages in the order in which their states had come in the Union. This is North and South. They saw 40,000 troops of various kinds pass, led by 20 generals. And in one of these carriages were 2 Confederate generals, being Joseph E. Johnston and Simon Bolivar Buckner, and they were included as a demonstration of how the nation was coming together, which of course is Grant had worked for all along. So there was all of that. It's a very, very dramatic and I think touching story.
He had a tremendous amount of respect from Southerners as well
Yes,
as
he did.
Northerners.
Yes, he did.
You mentioned in the book that General Robert E. Lee wouldn't allow anyone to speak illy or poorly of
Right.
Grant.
Right. No, that's exactly right. After Appomattox, where Grant set really new standards of military honor by the kind and gracious way in which he treated Lee, there was even more to it. First, I mean, Lee was deeply appreciative of the way he and his army were given a parole. They could go home, take their horses home, put out a crop to save the, children of the South might have died if that crop hadn't been put in so they could eat those grains the next winter. And but more than that, Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Abraham Lincoln, he wanted to try Lee for treason, which was a crime. He could have been hanged as a result of it. crime punishable by death. And Grant, as soon as he heard of this, marched into the White House and got hold of Johnson and said, if you arrest this man, who I have given the parole to, and his oldest men, I will resign from the United States Army and tell everybody why I'm doing it. And here was Grant, this immensely popular, victorious commanding general of the United States Army. And so Andrew Johnson and his men backed off, and of course Lee was further grateful. And anyway, Lee had only 5 years left to live, but during those 5 years he never allowed anybody to say a word against Grant.
Yes. Andrew Johnson actually went through impeachment proceedings.
Right, that's correct, yeah.
So,
And then Grant was the next president after that, and everybody has tried to say what a bad job he did as a president. Now what happened was, the first term went very well. The second term, his political opponents in Congress launched 37 different investigations of corruption in his administration. Not one of those investigations could pin anything on him. What was true, that he was unfortunately a trusting man. He trusted person after person that he thought was trustworthy. And sometimes men who'd been with him in the war, and he thought there's the same person, couldn't be bribed, couldn't be anything, and he was very, very wrong. And what is interesting is his eighth and final, as he was going out of office after 2 terms, his eighth and final, then it was called the annual message to Congress. Now it's called the State of the Union Address. Anyway, in it, the only case in American presidential history where he apologized to the nation. He did it by apologizing to the Congress and through them to the nation for his inadequacies as president. And he started by saying, I was called to the office of chief magistrate, meaning president, without any previous political experience. And then he went ... he sort of paused and said, it is inevitable that mistakes in judgment were made. All I will say is I always tried to do the best for all the people, keep it constitutionally legal, and so on. And so that stuck pretty well. He also, when just very shortly after he inaugurated, it was his pleasure, and he certainly made it a pleasure, indicated as a pleasure, to put before Congress the fact that all the states necessary had ratified the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which was the effort to protect the right of blacks to vote. And people don't think of him that much in terms of civil rights, but there's a professor at Princeton who's very much up on the subject. His name is Sean Willentz, W-I-L-L-E-N-T-Z. And Sean says that Grant, in terms of civil rights, did more for civil rights than anybody between Lincoln and Lyndon B. Johnson. And that's something I think, 1 in 100 Americans, if you ask them to guess, would not possibly come up with that. He also did some very interesting things for which he got no credit. For instance, you would think maybe if somebody said, well, who started the American National Parks? I think the name Teddy Roosevelt might come to mind.
yes.
He, in 1870, again, just after getting in, he signed a bill creating the Yellowstone National Park,
Yes.
which then, by doing that, he created the American National Park System, which in its turn was the first national park system in the world. But there's a lot about this guy. And when he was talking about the Indians, he said, I think the Indians probably were less trouble than the white men who incited the Indians. I mean, a lot, he said, that was certainly very politically incorrect for the day.
Very
Also,
controversial.
Very controversial. And then, again, in the White House, just a few weeks, but you can see this man had been thinking about, trying to heal the nation. A few weeks after he got in, he invited Robert E. Lee to come and visit him at the White House, call on him. And Lee, who did not want to come back to Washington and have to look at Arlington, which had been his family's home, which was the first thing invaded, if you want to view it as an invasion, at the beginning of the Civil War. And so he had the same idea. He'd been working down in what was then called Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, became Washington Lee University on his death. And he came because he felt that this was the right thing to do. He only had a few months left to live. And so it was a brief meeting, 15 minutes or so, but they both had the same idea. I mean, Grant was inviting the South back to the White House in the person of Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee, you know, who didn't really want to make this little visit to Washington, understood it, and they went through with it. So you had two men, thank God, for the nation, on North and South, working towards trying to heal the wounds of the war.
Some presidential historians have charged Grant with basically nepotism. He gave a lot of positions to family members, profitable positions. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes, I do. I think that's fair. I think he really, on the other hand, I think he often gave them to very worthy people. I mean,
yes.
Let me just give you one example, if I may. He had a general in the last, I mean, there's this idea that Grant wasn't a very bright guy. That is a big mistake. And during the last full year of the war, he created at his headquarters at City Point, Virginia, a 64-man unit called the Bureau of Military Information, which almost sounds like today would be a PR outfit or something. What it was an extremely sophisticated intelligence gathering group. The Confederacy had nothing like it, and they really, really did a great job of figuring out where the Confederates were, what they were going to do next, and so forth. Now, the point of that is he had it in the hands of one general who did a terrific job. Now, you could sort of cut it there. Then years later, when he's president, we get to Tammany Hall in New York City, where Tammany himself was just terrifically corrupt. Grant takes this same general, who's in civilian life at this point, and turns him loose on Tammany Hall. And this general, with the same sort of intelligence gathering knowledge and so forth, brings in enough evidence to put people behind behind bars and all this. Okay, when that's over, he rewards this general with the position of the collector of taxes for the Port of New York, but that's a pure pork barrel job. I mean,
Yes.
you automatically, if you had that job, which was definitely a patronage job, you got a percentage of everything unloaded or sent out of New York City by then ship or to some extent by train. So yes, he did those things, but when you look at some of the recipients, it wasn't just random or because he was somebody's friend or some relative. I mean, but yes, you could put that on it.
Yeah. Grant follows a long line of military leaders that went on to become president. And one thing I found interesting while researching his life was that he had the opportunity during the Mexican-American War to observe Zachary Taylor and was greatly influenced by Zachary Taylor, his decisions, the way he went about his business. Grant was a quartermaster and did see some fighting during the Mexican-American War. I was wondering what your thoughts on that was.
I think that's a very astute and well-read observation. There were two generals, and he saw both of them in action. One was Winfield Scott, who was known as Old Fuss and Feathers, who had been quite a general. He's a general from 1812 to 1861, the War of 1812. But Scott was all by the book, all uniforms, old fuss and feathers, all this. And then Jackson was entirely different and would walk around looking, no rank, no nothing, and kind of a sloppy, they call them dusters, a sloppy long raincoat or canvas coat. But he had a very different approach, and somehow I think that influenced Grant. Grant's, during the entire Civil War, he wore an enlisted man's blouse, so-called, an enlisted man's jacket, but then he did have the rank of general on his sleeves, but he could have had far, far fancier uniforms. I think he chose that whole method of very, very low key.
Where do you think he ranks among those presidents? Washington, Jackson, Taylor, Eisenhower, William Henry Harrison?
Well, I think he ranks extremely well. I think what happened was, let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt in 1900. At that time, Grant had already been dead for 15 years. And in a speech that Theodore Roosevelt made at that time, he put, without trying to go past just the military side of it, although it's included in this, he said that he thought that the three greatest Americans ever, while giving credit to Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, he thought that the three greatest Americans were George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant. And the reason he lumped Grant in there, put him in there, was he said, these are the three men who in the two times that it fell to the Americans to strike these tremendous blows for freedom. One, the independence of the 13 colonies, George Washington, that takes care of him. And then the combination of Lincoln politically and Grant militarily, that was the second great challenge, was to keep us from turning into two nations, one of which, the Confederacy, was committed to the legal the pursuit of slavery. And he ranked them right up there. So I think when you take that dimension in there, and I'm not passing, by your other generals by any means, but I think when you put that in there, he really does deserve to be one of the three great Americans. Now, as a general, I would like to speak to that point a little
Sure.
bit. And when they asked Winston Churchill after World War II, who some of his generals were, and his inimitable accent, he said, depends on the task. So obviously, if you wanted to compare some of our generals, the job of General Marshall in World War II was utterly different from Eisenhower, which was different from MacArthur in the Pacific and so forth. But I think that if you just, can I stop for a second?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just losing my train of thought. Oh, okay. What is often misunderstood about Grant is that he was a transitional figure in the history of warfare. And at Shiloh in 1862, he was galloping back and forth right behind the ranks of his infantrymen who were firing at Confederates that were 60 yards away, 80 yards away, 100 yards away. There wasn't even much chance of hitting anybody with the musketry at the time. So anyway, 2 years later, by which time Lincoln had brought him back to the east to be commander of the entire Union Army and specifically to oppose Robert E. Lee in Northern Virginia. He was commanding by sending telegraph orders to his different corps commanders from miles behind the lines. And if there was any doubt that somebody was picking up on this, when 1870, the Franco-Prussian War started, that business of generals waving their swords at the front of the columns was all over. They were all doing the same thing from back there. Now the other part of Grant, which I think is again very, very somehow lost sight of, it's all the bloody butcher stuff, and I want to address that in a minute.
Sure.
Anyway, so what you had then was that he alone among the generals on both sides saw that the rivers of the South were an integral part of a huge battlefield area. And he saw that by using these rivers, the Union could penetrate and cut up the Confederacy, which is exactly what he did, but that was the Grant's signature strategy. Then when you get to the later stages, he did indeed throw his men, he took huge casualties hitting Lee. Of course, Lee took bad casualties too. But anyway, so some of Lee's subordinates on one specific occasion, and I don't know that it didn't happen other times, but some of his subordinate generals and so forth, Lee's lieutenants as it were, they were trying to pep him up and say, well, look at what Grant is doing. He's just recklessly throwing, piling up corpses in front of our different positions and so forth, which was true to a degree. But what Lee said, his reply, this is cited and quoted and so forth, he said, I think General Grant is handling matters very well, because what Lee saw was exactly what was going on, that Grant would turn the corner around Petersburg, and Lee was being stretched farther and farther and farther around, and that Grant had more men to do it with, and that when that corner, and he said, once he gets to a certain point there, we're done for. And after the war, one of his Southern belles who saw him at the White Sulphur Springs, now the Greenbrier Hotel, said something, well, why didn't you tell them, General? He said they had to find out for themselves, which is a very questionable remark, but his idea was, I saw it coming, but I couldn't just call it off. I was committed to the defense of Richmond, which was the capital. Sometimes some people really don't know as much as they think they do about the Civil War. Say, well, why didn't he fall back from Richmond? He could have ended up in Raleigh, North Carolina, could have, you know, and then the Union would have had to go through all this hostile territory. And so, well, among other things, Richmond had been declared to be the capital of the Confederacy, and that could have been changed, I suppose. But they had the only cannon foundry in the whole Confederacy is right up there. Unfortunately for them, 95 miles, you know, south of Washington. It's called the Tredegar Iron Works. So there were a lot of reasons that Lee understood his job was to, and he did a remarkable job of it, was to hold that line, north-south line, from Richmond down to Petersburg. And he knew that as long as he could hold it, and there were still chances at times that maybe he could have made some last-minute remarkable attack in there. And if any man could have done it, it was Robert E. Lee, because the North was getting very, very sick of the war. And what Lee's hope was he could create some terrific, smashing surprise attack somewhere, and then, you know, the North would say, "This, we've had enough. We'll go to the negotiating table," and I think they would have.
Well, I think a lot of times when you look at history, logistics is what really wins wars. And it seems that Grant had a superior hold on logistics of war. And that's one of the things that helped him win the battles and ultimately win the war. I don't believe it served him as well in the White House, but it was definitely part of his genius as a military commander.
I think that's a very good point. And what is forgotten about Grant, because he sort of just comes up on people's screens, you know, when he finally takes over in the East. I mean, everybody forgets what a remarkable job the Vicksburg campaign was. He had a tremendous apprenticeship, if you will, with lesser casualties in the West.
Yes.
He had the chance to do that. So when he got to be opposite Lee, what really he always had at the back of his mind, he had started off as the supply officer in the Mexican War of what was called the 4th Infantry Regiment, United States Regulars. And he had a tremendous apprenticeship under fire. And he would, you know, he's supposed to be at the rear, but he was always fighting in the front too, but he always kept the supplies going up beautifully. And one day, in one of those battles in Mexico, I've forgotten which one right now, he had to ask somebody, the colonel asked 12 officers to step forward and said, "I need a volunteer to go up and see if it's true that they're running out of ammunition at the front, and to come back and tell me how much they need," and so forth. And of the 12, and they knew this was likely to be a suicide mission. So I mean, here's the combination of the logistics and the personal bravery and the rest of it. And he's then a young officer. And he, of the 12, only Grant stepped forward. He got on a horse, and he was always remarkable on horseback. And he goes tearing through this Mexican town with the enemy was just on one side. He, like a circus rider, is hanging down on the opposite side of the horse. He goes through the town. They shoot at him, but they only see him as he goes past these different side streets.
Yes.
And so he gets up there, finds out, comes back, you know, does a tremendous job. And what does he do? Everybody's praising him. He said, "Let's praise the horse." The horse is the one that really did it.
Yeah.
And he was remarkable on horseback. Now, then, when a few years after the war, but well before the Civil War, he is still a quartermaster, supply officer, and his regiment was moved to California, Northern California,
Yes.
on the coast. And so he is the man in charge of getting across the Isthmus of Panama. And there was the only ways to get to California were either go around Cape Horn or go across the Isthmus of Panama. So he's the supply officer. He gets down there, and there's a malaria epidemic, okay? And so there he is, and all the Mexicans are doubling their prices for renting mules and this and that. And he had to get something like 700 men and 100 wives and a number of children across the Isthmus of Panama, okay? So what he does, first of all, is tear up all the regulators. He's only supposed to give them, you know, $16 to rent a mule, and they were charging $32. He immediately just breaks all the regulations, rents the mules for $32 and says, the hell with it, I'll face the consequences later on. And then with all this, he starts them across the peninsula. He gets them across the peninsula to the other side. He loses some people on the way. He gets to the other side, and there a lot of people of his command, including women, children, everybody else, are coming down with illnesses that the fever hadn't struck them until they got to the west coast. Okay, and so what he does is he sees a big old empty ship out in the harbor. He charters, rents the ship, and turns it into a hospital ship. He puts all the sick people out there, and then at the risk of his own life, because some of these people were dying, he every day went out there. He got rounded up from everywhere, any way he could, with good food, good stuff, soups, mutton soup, kills the sheep and gives them mutton soup. And he gets a remarkable percentage of those people who are on the hospital ship. He's isolated them so nobody else is going to get the disease. And he stayed out there, and one of the people who was out there with him said he was just a man of iron. He didn't sleep, he didn't, he was always out there working with us every day. So he certainly knew logistics in many different aspects, and you're perfectly right. And when what brought him and Sherman together the first time in the Western Theater was at Fort Donelson, which was one of the things leading up to the victory at Vicksburg. He was down the river, and he kept sending back for certain things, supply ships. And suddenly he realized that somebody up the river was a really good supply officer, because he'd say, you might send up the river for more bandages or nurses or ammunition or whatever it was. But the next ship down, even before his request got up there, would be just what he was looking for. And he said, who is this guy? The guy was William Tecumseh Sherman, who also had a background in logistics. So I'm just making your point that
yes,
logistics were vital. Both men were very skilled at it, and it paid off in the long run.
Now, he had some darker days. He had to leave the military in 1854. Was he an alcoholic?
I'd love to talk about that. Love to talk about it. In 1854, this was after he'd gotten the regiment out there to California, and he was desperately lonely. He and Julia had made the right decision. They had one child, and she had another on the way. And when he told her, when they discussed what they were going to face if she accompanied him out there, they both agreed no, she was going to stay back east during this tour of duty. Desperately lonely out there, plenty to testify about it. Started drinking some, and then was drunk, but not drunk in a way that was bothering people. Then on a payday, he was drunk, and very visibly so. And so he was in charge of paying the men, and he just, who knows whether there were coins scattered all over the place or whatever, but anyway, it was very noticeable. And his colonel said, Grant, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either face a court-martial or resign from the Army. And Grant said to a couple of his friends, I would never have Julia know that I was court-martialed, even though they thought he would become acquitted. But, he said, I would never want Julia to know that I was. So the answer is he drank some. Now, during the more important part of that is that, and he did leave the Army and didn't come back until Fort Sumter. And so, but what is important in the Civil War is that not once during that entire time was he incapacitated through alcohol, okay? Now, there are a couple of incidents that there's different evidence. At one point, the story was he was on a horse during a parade in New Orleans, and that the horse got, one was that he was drunk and fell off the horse, okay, and it certainly hurt his leg, whatever happened. The other is the horse was, some steam engine started up or some unusual noise, the horse shied and threw him off, which for Grant would be very unusual. But the point is there were those stories, and I think there is evidence that he may have, but never at a time when it made any difference. And I want to just say one more thing. There's this story, but it's only a story, that the generals or some congressional delegation went to Lincoln and said, we think you got to get rid of this drunk. And that Lincoln said to them, gentlemen, if I knew what kind of liquor he was drinking, I'd want to send a barrel to all my generals. Now, it's a lovely story, and somebody went to Lincoln and said, "Is it who?" And Lincoln loved stories like that, you know, and
Sure.
and was the true teller of such tales sometimes. But they went to Lincoln. Somebody later in the war, because he didn't live out the war, but said, "Did you really say that, President Lincoln?" And Lincoln said, "No, but I certainly wish I had." So anyway, but so I don't think that the story of Grant as this drunk is it's colorful. It's the kind of thing that catches on, and the idea that he was just this indiscriminate butcher, and the idea he wasn't very bright. But none of that is true.
You mentioned something when we were just speaking of the possible court-martial and how he never wanted his wife to know that he would have been court-martialed.
True.
Can you talk to me a little bit about his relationship with his wife,
Great
with his
story.
kids? He was a great family man.
Love to tell you the story. He was at West Point. He had a great friend, another cadet named Frederick Dent, and so when Grant was graduated, his first assignment was down to the 4th Infantry, which was at a place, a fort just below St. Louis. Okay, and so he rides up to a place called Whitehall, which was this rather small plantation by Southern, but very attractive, and sort of says, "I'm the brother of West Point cadet." And pretty quickly, he was taking long, after his duties every day, only a few miles away at this fort, he would come down and he'd go out riding with Julia Dent, the sister of the West Point cadet. And so this young couple didn't really realize that they were falling in love. She was a very outdoor girl, and she had these brothers and all this stuff, and she loved to fish. He liked to fish. She loved to ride. She was very good at that. And one of the interesting things about her was she was cross-eyed, which I'll save for a moment later, but she was very vivacious, very intelligent. Anyway, so then the Mexican War comes along, and he realizes, and in his memoirs, he says, "I realized something was wrong with me." And what was wrong was he was going to go away from her. So he's then also in his memoirs, he says, "In the most awkward way imaginable, I brought up the subject with Julia. But before we parted, he to go off to this war, it was agreed that we would join our fortunes at a future date." Anyway, so they did get married, and when he got back, some years later, she waited for him for 4 years. And so Bruce Catton, the fine Civil War historian, said that their marriage, their romance, I mean, he said it was one of the great romantic American love stories, and I think it was. They were singularly devoted. And one of the other interesting things was that any time in the war that she got right up front, you know, and whether that helped the possible drinking situation, I don't know. But at one time, they were at his headquarters at City Point, Virginia, and they were holding hands in this inner room, like young couple. And this officer comes banging in and says, "I'm terribly sorry, General, but a Confederate gunship is coming down the river." And so Grant immediately sort of starts writing orders and stuff. And he was smoking a cigar, and Julia said it looked like a little steam engine. The smoke was coming, puffs were coming out. And so then so he was handing out these orders to deal with the subject, and she says, "Ulysses," as she called him, "what should I do?" And he looks at her, sort of blinks, and says, "Well, you know, you shouldn't be here at all." And in her memoirs, she said, "But he had sent for me." You know? So, but they were very, very close, very close. And it's a very nice story. And then getting back to the cross-eyed part, when in 1864, he already, while still a general and all that, he was already being spoken of as a future presidential candidate. And so she went to see this eye doctor in St. Louis, where she happened to be at the moment, and said, "Could I get this cross-eyed condition, you know, because my husband's getting to be so famous, and I'd like to, you know, be more presentable." And she was not a person giving her appearance much thought. And the guy said, "Well, I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Grant, if you'd done this 20 years ago when you're a young woman, but now it's too late." So she went to Ulysses to talk about this. And when she finished, he said, "Julia, whatever put the idea of this operation in your mind?" She said, "Well, you're getting to be such a famous man, and I'm such a plain little wife, and I thought maybe it could be helpful, you know. And he took her in his arms and said, "Those are my eyes, you know, they belong to me, and if, with different eyes I might not like you half so well, so don't fool with them." But, you know, it's a very touching, the way she recounted it in her own autobiography, which came out many years later. But there was a great relationship, and he was very, very strong on family and children and grandchildren.
He
and
was
so
very
forth.
affectionate with
Very
towards his
affectionate.
kids.
Here's this guy supposed to be this block of ice, anything but. And he had this daughter Nellie. He had 3 sons and a daughter Nellie. And Nellie lived in England with what turned out to be sort of a philandering, not so good Englishman.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was the White House social event of probably the whole 19th century,
Yes.
when she and this Englishman were married at the White House. And after they left, Grant was found upstairs in Nellie's room, lying on her bed crying, you know. And he just missed her terribly. And then when she couldn't get a straight answer out of the doctors about his cancer. And so since she couldn't, she just came to the States and stayed with him to the end of his life. And he was so happy when she came over. And he was dying, but he was working hard on his memoirs and so forth. But he couldn't sleep for some nights, and somebody was in the house, a member of the family, said this wasn't the cancer that came out, he was just so happy she was back. And they did take some carriage rides in Central Park and so forth. And suddenly he was taking 2 rides a day with Nellie, and, you know, all this stuff. And when he was dying, this was sort of demonstration of how things had changed in the public's view of Grant. Now, granted, it was in Manhattan, in Northern City, but when he would come out to take these rides in Central Park, get out the door, there'd be crowds outside. They were waiting all the time, and sometimes they would applaud when they saw him, and he just crossed the thing and got into a carriage, or was helped into a carriage. And or they sometimes were completely silent. The mood might change, and the men in the crowd would take off their hats. But when it came to be the anniversary of Appomattox or his birthday, they're all over the country. These congratulations came pouring in, and it was from the south as well as the north. And when he had his that 63rd and final birthday, he not only got very nice letters from kids, he became sort of a figure to a generation that wasn't even born at the time of Appomattox, but also there was one particular from the Confederate Survivors Association meeting at a cemetery in Augusta, Georgia. But they said, you know, standing by the graves of our Confederate dead, we want to wish you everything good. We haven't forgotten Appomattox, and we hope that you will get through this in the best possible condition. And so it was pretty touching.
Another thing that a lot of people do not know about Grant is that he was a very shy person.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult for those people who are shy to take such a public persona, become president, lead the army.
Yeah.
That was another struggle. That was another aspect of his personality that he had to overcome on his way to greatness.
No, that's true. But what was particularly interesting was that, you know, he went on this trip with Julia to Europe for 2 years, around the world trip, after being in the White House. Largely, I think, because she wanted to do it. And this was supposed to be them as just 2 private citizens on a sightseeing trip. He'd been in the army, he'd served the country as president for 8 years. You know, the idea was, now it's time for a vacation. Well, what happened was that the nation after nation, yes, they went to see, they dined at Windsor Palace with Queen Victoria and so forth, but the big thing was, in city after city after city, these huge crowds turned out just to see him, you know. And I think what it was, and he was shy, but he managed, you know, he felt very much in touch with the common man. I mean, here was this son of this operator of a small tannery in Ohio, and I think they sensed that he felt he too was of the yeomanry, a man of the people who'd done extraordinary things, but nonetheless. And I think the crowds bucked him up quite a bit. I mean, I think he saw that, and they saw in him, so I think it was easier for him than some of his earlier times in Washington or something like that. I think there's just a sense, and also, by the way, again, people think Grant wasn't so smart. He had a 2-hour talk at the request of Prince Otto von Bismarck, who, in Grant's words, was the great statesman of Europe of the day. And Bismarck wanted to talk to him about what Grant thought about not only what he'd been through in the States, but how he saw the world, and was very satisfied with the talk. And then when he got out to the last couple of countries they went to were China and Japan, and he so impressed the rulers of both China and Japan that they asked him to resolve a dispute about the Ryukyus Islands, which is a chain of islands sort of between the two countries. And he did it in a way that solved the problem for a long, long time. So, that is not the actions of a dummy who just happened to be at the right place at the right time. So he's really a very impressive man, and I think when it came time, when people understood that he was dying, I think they really understood, North and South, that a lot of people just realized, wait a minute, he was kind of a defective president, or ineffective president, particularly the second term with the 37 investigations, which finally resulted in him getting 2 of his sons in as private secretaries, and because he found, who else can I trust? I mean, everybody I've trusted has blown up on me, or turned out to be acting behind my back or taking bribes. So he had his 2 sons in there. But I think that a lot of people realized you could be a very great man and still have been an ineffective president.
I think you could also make the case that he was effective in certain ways. Reconstruction continued,
Yes. Yeah.
and he helped put the country back together.
Yes, he did.
And you can look at a parallel between him and George Washington, where their presidencies were almost an extension of their military careers, where George Washington was able to defeat the British, but if it wasn't for his presidency, who knows where the states would have gone. I think you can kind of, in some sense, say the same about Grant. He defeated the South, but it was his time in the White House that also helped heal the nation.
Yeah.
So while logistically he might not have been as effective, there might have been some scandals, having a man like that in the White House was effective.
It was, and also the one thing he had not forgotten how to do is use the army. And in 1870, he used the army to foil the Ku Klux Klan. There's no question about it. And insofar as he could enforce the laws that were being imposed on the South, which embittered many white Southerners, these black code laws that were meant to, they were trying in the Southern legislatures to act as if the war had never happened,
Yes.
And he, by upholding the fact that Virginia, a very proud state, became military district number 1, was called that and acted as that. So he used the army pretty effectively, but then when he was out, things began to slip backwards. But you're absolutely right about that. I think he was. He used the army very well. Something else that was interesting was there was something called the Panic of 1873, which was often considered a bad moment, and he was held responsible for it. There's a Wall Street collapse, a lot happened. But that is interesting to note this, particularly in this particular year. That collapse actually started when a bank in Vienna, then the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it failed. It was already the telegraph and the transatlantic cable was very much in place, okay? So when there was bad news in a place like Vienna, it was a matter of minutes so they knew about it in the Paris Bourse or in Berlin or in the London Stock Exchange. And then it was seconds to go across the Atlantic Ocean. So when that news came, it actually started a week of panic on Wall Street, which ended up with the stock exchange being closed and so forth. Now, today, bad news in Europe translated bad news here and vice versa, but not any quicker than that. And whether he could have done more, but it would be very unfair to view the Panic of 1873 as the doing of Ulysses S. Grant. I mean, it just wasn't what happened.
Yes.
The book is Grant's Final Victory. The author is Charles Bracelen Flood. Thank you for your time today.
I've enjoyed it, and it's fun to talk to somebody who really knows about the subject.
Yes.
You got 5 more minutes if you'd like.
Whatever you like. We could go into one other thing, is this biographical counterattack that took place, you know, undermining Grant's reputation, if you like.
Sure,
I mean,
sure. I'd love to hear about it. Yes,
okay.
sir.
Well, at the time, Theodore Roosevelt was quite rightly characterizing Grant as one of the 3 greatest Americans in history, American history, to that date, in 1900. They were beginning to start, and this is kind of interesting because it started more in the North than the South, although plenty of willing, not accomplices, but associates in this. There was this whole biographical counterattack was starting about some of it perfectly true and some of it not, but the lost cause, the noble South, and unfortunately a lot of people who bought into this were Northern professors who got into this Reconstruction era revisionism at the time. And what they were doing was, very unfairly I think, they wanted to elevate Robert E. Lee, which was fine, because Lee was a great man and a great general and a good force for reconciliation.
Of course.
But what they did was they thought, well, to get Lee up to where we want him to be, we will begin really slamming Grant. And as late as 1992, you had an American professor saying, in effect, how Grant could look at himself in the mirror, I don't know. You know, but that is how long that went. And now, as I say, the pendulum is swinging back, but I don't think it's swinging too far back. I think Grant is now finally being recognized as the admirable man he was, and a much better president than he's been given credit for. Not one of the great presidents, but
No.
overall one of the great figures.
Yeah, I think his presidency was a little bit underrated. It certainly wasn't as effective as other presidencies were, but I don't believe that he should be considered one of the worst presidents
No.
or you know, really an ineffective president. I
No.
mean, he was effective in some ways.
No, he was. And think of what he inherited. I mean,
Of course.
he came into a terrible situation. The war had only been over 4 years when he was sworn in, or 5 years.
The 2 presidents before Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson was impeached.
Yeah.
It was a tough position to
Yeah.
walk into.
So he, given the givens, and that's the only way to judge these things fairly, is what did it look like
Of
then,
course.
from behind his desk,
Yeah.
not behind ours now.
Oh, of course, yeah, and we don't know a lot of the decisions. We know now what
Right.
decisions Grant had to make, but
Mhm.
the press back then,
Mhm.
the general public,
Mhm.
they didn't know every decision that he had, and they didn't have all the facts
Yeah.
either. So
Yeah. In fact, he was just barely in office when this effort was made to corner the gold market, and with a forgotten Secretary of the Treasury named George Boutwell, he fought that off. He fought it
Of
off.
course.
And so, you
led
know,
by Jay Gould, if I
that's
if I
right.
recall
That
correctly.
was Jay Gould. That's exactly right. And Jay Gould thought he'd cornered all the gold, and he pulled the rug out from. What was interesting is Jay Gould, with good lawyers, never got arrested. And when this whole Ponzi scheme came about, it was Grant's son Buck who was in on this with his father, and ruined financially too. But he walked over to talk to Jay Gould down in Wall Street, because he thought, well, you know, Gould knows still, whatever he's done, he knows more about American finance than anybody else. And Jay Gould looked at this portfolio of things that Ferdinand Ward of this Grant and Ward company had been touting, and he said, these aren't worth the paper they're written on. So at least, you know, so Gould finally did him a little favor by saying, you're right, you've been just
Swindled.
Swindled,
Yeah.
swindled, the very word. Yeah.
Yes, hoodwinked.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
1 minute.
okay.
Can wrap up.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, in closing, it's a wonderful read, very eloquently written. And do you have any final thoughts?
No, only that I hope, I'm not suggesting I did this as a public service, but I do hope it will give the American public that gets hold of this a little different view of Ulysses S. Grant, because the public deserve it. He was a man of the people. You know, the public should have this man back again. I mean, I wrote a piece called "Welcome Home, General Grant." I mean, he should be in the home of the hearts of the American people, and I'm hoping that this book might do something toward that, toward accomplishing that.
Thank you. Grant's Last Victory, the author is Charles Bracelen Flood.
I would like you to say for our audience, this is Charles Bracelen Flood on visual radio.
You want me to say it as I sign it, or
You can
first
do
look
that,
at
or
it?
you can look right at the
All right.
camera.
This is Charles Bracelen Flood on visual radio.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
And as you're signing, I'm going to ask you, how was the book event today?
I think it went very, is this on?
Yeah, we're on.
No, I think the Boston Book Festival was very good. They had I believe, a terrific panel, the Civil War panels. I'm not saying I was terrific by myself, but I thought they covered the Civil War from so many different angles. They had Tony Horwitz with this remarkable book he's written in the past. He's gone beyond it now to a book about John Brown, but he had this book, Confederates in the Attic, and I thought I knew a lot about the Civil War, and I was putting in post-its in his book every 2 pages,
Wow.
stuff that I'd covered but never knew the backstory or the right story or the corrected story. Then they had Drew Gilpin Faust, president of Harvard, who did a wonderful book called The Republic of Suffering, about how the nation had never had to deal with 600,000 casualties in 4 years. I mean, she projected it into today's population, there'd be like 6 million today or something. And she did a terrific job on that. And we had Adam Goodhart, who did an excellent book on 1861, the year the war was started. And then trying to think who else we had. I think that was it. And then our moderator was a Harvard Law professor named Gordon Rees, Annette Gordon Rees, who did a book a little different from this, and she was the moderator, but she had done the book about well done too. So I felt, I don't like to say honored, but I felt very pleased to be included in that panel. And I think we came at the war from so many different angles that nobody there could have, I think everybody there learned something, or learned that there's a slightly different point of view on something. So I felt it was a very well done event.
We really appreciate your time today. Thank
Well,
you
I've
so much.
enjoyed it very much.
And they're moving, DeCapo's moving, so this is probably the final interview in this publishing house as they move
But
into
I
Boston.
do want to tell you, I think it's great to give somebody the kind of time you just gave me. I know you have to cut it up and all that, but
No, we're probably going to let it run.
well, okay.
That's-
But I mean, no, but that's a great way to do it. Sit me down with somebody who really knows what he's talking about. He's got enthusiasm for the subject. Let me run, and then, after 10 minutes, he steps in with another very good question. It went off very well.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, great pleasure. Now, I'm doing this to Joe. What's
To Joe.
To Joe, just to Joe, or do you last? To Joe. What do you want? Just tell me.
Joe's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Jay, what's your background in the history major?
Yeah, I'm an undergraduate in history and political science, and my master's degree is actually in management. But I actually want to write history books myself.
You do?
Yeah,
Oh.
so, yeah, it's the Civil War was very, I love the Civil War. Like I said, we traveled around, visited the battlefields when I was younger.
I've got the right of writing. This is good.
I just love.
You can use it for the
any history.
Okay.
Yeah,
So,
that's good.
credits.
yeah, I love the opportunity to come and speak to authors. I think it's great.
Yeah.
It's awesome. So,
You do a great job.
thank you, appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I've learned some new things even